I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This episode I'm interviewing horticultural journalist Matthew Appleby. Matthew writes for gardening magazines, national newspapers and the trade publication Horticulture Week and is currently the Garden Media Guild Journalist of the Year. This is the last of the vegan gardening series here on the podcast and I can't think of a better way to cap it off. Matthew is championing the vegan gardening movement as a natural progression of the whole green agenda. Vegan gardening dovetails so well with many of the concerns that are top of the agenda for many of us: wildlife awareness, organic growing, a healthy diet, a healthy lifestyle. He touches on some things that many of us do without thinking, such as using manure on our gardens and why this doesn't work for him. And it's great because he flags up things in a really non-judgy way. The idea of vegan gardening isn't meant to make us feel uncomfortable. It's more about examining what we use and what we buy for our gardens so that we can make informed judgments because, after all, to quote the old cliche, knowledge is power. Matthew's written a book called The Super Organic Gardener, which is due out on the 31st of January, and it offers loads of practical advice about growing plants if you're thinking of making the move towards organic gardening and away from using animal products. So I thoroughly recommend picking up a copy on Thursday. And make sure to stay tuned beyond the interview as I'll be announcing how you can win a copy of the book. I started out by asking Matthew to explain what his particular brand of gardening entails.
I see it as being like organic gardening but going a step further, because organic gardening isn't necessarily stock-free, meat-free, animal product-free gardening. You see it as the sort of cleanest form of gardening, but in fact you can go a step further. And, it's like how people used to see vegetarianism as, the best way of eating. But obviously now veganism has become a lot more mainstream. And it's an obvious next step. And to me, this is an obvious next step if you're an organic gardener or if you really care about what you're growing and what you're eating. And
can you do vegan gardening without being organic? Do the two have to go hand in hand?
Oh, that's a really good question. I've never really thought about that. I suppose you can, yeah. It's a bit like you could use peat, couldn't you? If you're a vegan gardener, but you probably wouldn't because you wouldn't see it as environmentally sound. So it's a kind of holistic thing, isn't it? A whole green ethos where just artificial fertilizers and chemicals just don't fit into the way you think about the world. So I can't really see any vegan gardener who wouldn't be an organic gardener because you just view the world as a green place where you want to be green. Yeah, I think you can be, but you wouldn't be. It's kind of the same way that vegans, I don't know, can they still eat Oreos? You used to be able to eat Oreos if you were a vegan because they've got so many artificial ingredients in, they don't actually have any milk in them. But you probably wouldn't eat them because they're just junk.
Yes, true. Yeah, having said that, I have been known to have a few. I think for me it was a labelling issue because I think veganic gardening assumes that you're organic, but you don't necessarily have to be. Saying that you're a vegan gardener could just mean that you're a vegan who gardens. So for me, vegan gardening is the best term, I suppose, that I can think of to label the movement.
I'm with you there, and there is a bit about this labelling which I think is important because when I spoke at VegFest in October, it was the permaculture section, and I don't think the general population understands what permaculture is, and I want this to be a popular movement. I want it to affect more people than people who already know about it. So I think we need to get a term, which is vegan gardening, not organic, not permaculture, not stock-free, not super organic, which is what the publishers decided to use for my book, but vegan because it's just much more simple.
Yeah, I agree. I do think it does what it says on the tin. So why is that style of gardening important to you and why is it important to the wider environment?
As I say, if you care about what you eat, you need to care about how you grow it. And now we've got, a minimum of 600,000 vegans, but maybe 3 million or somewhere in between in the UK. So the only way to tell the true provenance is to grow it your own, really. That's the perfect way of doing this. Look at foot of mouth that's come up in Scotland recently. It shows that the food standards in Britain aren't good. You get told they are, but they're not. So it is important to garden as purely as possible if you want to actually grow something which, is going to be as good for you as possible. And for the wider environment too, because you can do your bit and you can feel better about yourself.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is veganism, do you think, it is gaining a lot of traction at the moment. Is it perhaps a backlash to all the problems that we've had relating to food over the past few years?
I would say so, and I've been talking a bit about how it's a time of flux as well. It's a time of division, and it's a time of debate to do with Brexit, to do with Trump. If you're looking at these big, wider issues, and obviously to do with online. So people have views, and people's views are quite polarized at the moment. So people are taking stances, and that means they're getting more extreme. And the way I've been looking at it, 30 years ago, we had Smiths and Meters murder, but we also had the Animal Liberation Front, and we had Hunter-Sabbatarian. These things maybe work in kind of generational cycles slightly, because 30 years before that, you had a lot of radicalism at the late 60s and hippies and a lot of vegetarianism then. And then before that, in the late 40s, you had the Vegan Society formed, and you had a lot of political extremism there post-war when people were finding a position in a kind of new free world. Maybe I'm going too far there.
Well, no, it's definitely interesting. I had not thought about that at all. So a lot of people are getting very interested in vegan eating, but I think for some people it's not necessarily something that they would translate through into gardening, because even as a gardener and as a vegan, I hadn't really put the two and two together until I went to see you at the Vegan Garden Festival. What are a lot of people using, do you think, unwittingly? I mean, I was vegetarian before I was vegan as well, but I would put bloodfish and bone on a garden. Do you think there are a lot of products that people are using unwittingly that come from animal sources?
Well, I mean, animal manures is a big one. It's just a norm, isn't it? Like people put horse manure on a plot, and you wouldn't think otherwise. And, I think this is just trying to make people think about it. When I first started writing about it, the only real information I could find was stuff which was going out to people who already knew about it, like a very small circle, vegan organic network type people. The only book I could find on Amazon was from 1986, Veganic Gardening, 30 years ago. I mean, there are books around it which I've found since, but they're basically preaching to the converted in some way. So now it's become a much, much bigger issue, and it is doing week by week as we go along. I want people to realise that maybe they're not gardening as good as what they could be. But it's not just the products you add in on, like the animal manures, the bloodfish and bone fertilisers, because these products aren't labelled. Food products are labelled, so you can check the label, but gardening products aren't labelled, so you don't actually know what's in them. You don't know what's in peat. You don't know what's in the fertilisers. And there will be products in the future which I think will be labelled, or they'll certainly be labelled as a vegan symbol. But I'd also add stuff like wild bird care products that people are buying. And, I'm sort of questioning whether you should feed birds in gardens, because I don't think that's what wildlife gardening should be about. I don't think trying to attract animals to your garden and treat them like pets or treat your garden like a zoo is wildlife gardening. But like a lot of wildlife gardeners would say that.
Yeah, I read that in your book. I was interested. I mean, I do feed my birds, but as you say, anything like the fat balls and the suet balls, all of that are presumably byproducts from the meat and dairy industries. And so all the time I'm buying those products, I'm kind of, in a way, roundabout way, supporting those industries. So it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I wouldn't be too sort of preachy about it. It's obviously not the worst thing in the world to do, to feed the birds in the garden, but you might be feeding them suet, as you say. But it's a broader thing about, should we have pets? Should we treat wild animals as something we can sort of use for our entertainment?
Yeah, it is. It's just good to think about these things, because a lot of things you just do automatically. So it doesn't hurt, I don't think, to actually stop and think a little bit about the ramifications of, even if you're not saying to people, oh, you can't feed your wild birds. But it is interesting, and it's a very good point, and it is something that we do need to think about. But I think what surprises a lot of people, and again, for me, I just thought, why can't I put manure in my garden? What is wrong with it? From your point of view, why shouldn't vegan gardeners use manure?
You make a good point about, what's wrong with using manure from your local horse sanctuary, where these animals, aren't farmed animals, they're rescued animals. I guess there's health reasons around not using manures. They've got zoonoses such as E. coli, listeria, salmonella. We've seen loads and loads of health problems emerging from them. The other thing about horse manures is they've got pesticides in them because the grass they're eating is full of pesticides. So sticking on your plants might well kill your plants. There's been studies done around that in recent years. We've seen foot and mouth, we've seen mad cow disease coming from the animal farming industry. We've seen horse meat scandals. The animal industry can't be trusted regarding your health. Obviously, vegans don't want to support animal farming. So if you're using the byproduct, you could say it's the same as using leather, if you're using the manures. Well, I have been asked by this. I got asked by this by someone, a BBC researcher on Radio 4, who said that they're going to shit anyway. But it's like, that's not the point. It's not the point.
No, it's not. No, it isn't really when you think about it. I think that's important for, some people, particularly, there was a Daily Mail article out this morning, which I just mentioned to you, but that was saying, oh, well, how ridiculous that you can't use manure. But even if you said you sourced it from somewhere like a rescue sanctuary, even then there are implications beyond just the animal welfare. It's also the kind of human welfare. I do know somebody who got very ill from manure. So, there are other implications, which, again, are important to think about.
I dug around and did a bit of research into that and found some scientific papers. And when I wrote a piece for Gardener's World in October, I included that, and they wanted more references. They wanted more proof. But, I think having some scientific papers saying that these bacteria can remain for 3 months within the manures and they can give you very bad health problems is an issue. Obviously, people have been using them for all time. So, it suits a lot of farming, but it certainly is the first thing to get rid of if you're going to be a vegan gardener.
I think what you said when I heard you speak about your book was it was really important what you said. It's not about what you can't use, it's about what you can use. And I think that's probably the key to it.
Well, I just crossed my mind then when I was saying this is the first thing you cut out. It's not necessarily the first thing you cut out, it's the first thing you replace. It's about the replacement, not about what you're not using. And
another problem, an issue that has been mentioned in response to the growing interest in vegan eating is that a lot of the products that vegans eat will actually contribute to the destruction of soils. And you mentioned in your book that on your personal plot, you use the no-dig technique of gardening. So why is that central to how you garden?
Well, you can leave the soil fauna to draw the nutrients down into the soil naturally, and you retain the natural soil structure. You avoid panning, which is creating a hard barrier so the water can't get in. You avoid erosion. You avoid nutrient loss. You also avoid weed spread by not digging the soil. The secret... Well, it's not even a secret. You just use a hoe. You hoe the weeds and you grow cover crops and you don't leave much soil which isn't covered. But digging, I used to love digging because it's great exercise, but you just don't need to do it for a start. And it's actually a bad thing to do. I just talked about that Gardener's World piece. Like Charles Dowding wrote a piece answering my thing about vegan gardening and basically agreed with everything I said, apart from he said he didn't like the label. Obviously, Charles Dowding is Mr. No-Dig Gardener, and no-dig gardening is absolutely taking off. People are increasingly realising that's the way to do things. The Horticulture event, the vegan gardening event, someone did ask, are you allowed to dig up potatoes? And yes, you are.
You are, yeah. Well, that's good to know. I mean, digging is one of those things. The satisfaction of digging over a plot and then reflecting back on it is going to be really hard to kind of get some people out of doing that.
But long term, it won't do any good.
No, exactly. And that is, again, that's another thing. It's just considering sort of the implications of what you're doing. But one of the major problems that us gardeners who have always done things traditionally are going to find is that we are inundated initially maybe with pests, and everyone's going to say slugs, there's such a big problem. What do you do? Can you give me just a few examples of the ways that you deal with pests in your garden?
Yeah, I just pick them off, slugs and snails. You just go out early in the morning or late at night and pick them off. You use green manures, they've got something else to eat. You use wild patches for predators. You use sacrificial plants. But the bottom line is, if it costs an animal's life to grow it, then just don't grow it. It's not like you're trying to be self-sufficient. I've written a lot about allotments over the years and whether you can be self-sufficient by growing enough food on your plot and how big your plot needs to be self-sufficient. But at the end of the day, you're going to go to the supermarket and buy a load of potatoes and carrots for 50p. So if you have to kill a load of slugs to create 50p's worth of potatoes and carrots, just don't do it.
Yeah, that actually is another question I was going to ask. Is there anything that you don't grow because it's just too difficult?
there's lots of things I don't grow because I'm not very good at growing them. Like carrots, I'm really bad at growing, and they always come out rubbish. And I do try most things. Luckily as a horticultural journalist,